Judge Dingell, John III, Jennifer, Gabrielle, Romy, Robin, Jim, Jewel. It is hard at this point in time, after three extraordinary speakers, not to be redundant, and I'm sure I will be. John Dingell was known by all of you here. There's nothing, therefore, that I can tell you about John Dingell that you don't already know. We know, of course, John Dingell, like all of us, was not perfect. None of us are. But we know how very, very good he was. We know that is why he kept getting reelected to Congress more than any person in the history of our country. Elected to do the people's work in the people's house. And what an extraordinary record he achieved in the almost 60 years he served. John Dingell made a profound difference on behalf of millions of his fellow citizens and indeed people around the world. He was fair-minded, but as has been said, and all of you know, he was tough, very tough. Many have known his fierce and biting judgment. Many, too, will recall, as has been said, his gentle soul. He was intolerant of evil, intolerant of injustice, intolerant of malfeasance and incompetence, and made sure everyone knew it. At the same time, he was an advocate and fighter for tolerance. Jim Clyburn, you know that. Like all of you, I saw his great strength, his patriotism, and his extraordinary adoration of the lovely Deborah. Like you, I saw him as a man of both complexity and, yes, simplicity. A man who served so well his country, his family, his state, his community, the House of Representatives, and we, his colleagues. That's how all of us knew John Dingell. When I first arrived in Congress, John had already been there for over a quarter of a century. And I had the privilege of serving with him for 33 years. Like many of the freshmen at the time, I saw him as larger than life. He was imposing, yes, intimidating. He was, as John Lewis has said, Chairman John Dingell, seemingly unapproachable. At the time, it made me think of an old country ballad sung by Tennessee Ernie Ford. It told of a giant of a man who held up the buckling timber in a collapsing mine, allowing all others in that mine to escape. Big John, that miner was called. John Dingell was to us freshmen our very own Big John, a larger-than-life figure who had raised up the institution of the House as a legislator and as a leader in our party. As the years passed and I got to know John the man, not only as John the chairman, and as it turned out, he was approachable. Who knew? He was, I discovered, as so many of you did, as tender as he was tenacious. And he became a dear, dear friend. Thank you, Debbie, for allowing me to say a few words. I never stopped looking up to him as a senior colleague. Even as he became my dear friend, he continued to be Big John to all of us with whom he served. And Big John was a master of the house, as has been said. On occasion, he would unabashedly use his power as a chairman to cut through the confusion on an issue and impose his will when he believed it to be morally correct thing to do. He once gavelled a committee meeting to adjournment right before he was about to lose the vote, declaring, "You may have the votes, but I've got the gavel." And more often than not, he ultimately got the votes too. John liked and respected every member with whom he served for having been elected by their neighbors to represent them in the Congress. That is, at least, until they gave John a reason not to. He never minced words. He never held back. Sincere, earnest, determined, courageous, persuasive, bold, indefatigable, at times acerbic. Say amen. Amen. The voices you just heard are those who knew that personally. And so many times, of course, gentle and encouraging. The love he showed those of us who were his colleagues was often tough love. He loved us sometimes with soft words and sometimes with sharp elbows. Democrats, and Fred, as you pointed out, Republicans alike. John handed out barbs as often as he handed out punchki. Those are Polish donuts. If I mispronounced it, I apologize. And how fortunate we were to have both. From the biting letters he wrote to his pointed questioning of witnesses, from his unyielding advocacy for legislation ahead of its time, to his tweets so undeniably of their time. Deep inside the man, we found an immeasurable determination to make the House of Representatives, his state of Michigan, and his beloved America a better place. He used his time in the office to do exactly that. John fundamentally understood what the House of Representatives can be when it's at its best. He saw it as an engine by which representatives can transform love of country into the tools of justice and security and opportunity for the people we serve. We all know the tools he helped fashion: health care reform, Medicare, the Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Endangered Species Act, civil rights, voting rights, support for all working families, and in particular, of course, Michigan's auto workers, whom he loved and who loved him. His respect and admiration for working people were manifested in his dedication to the men and women who build our cars and to the United States auto workers. He was their steadfast champion, and in doing so, championing the hopes and dreams of every working American. The list of legislation shaped by his hand stretches as long as his unrivaled tenure. Early last week, called and said that John wasn't doing so well. So I got on a plane last Wednesday and flew to Michigan. Debbie greeted me at the door in Dearborn. She, of course, was the love of John's life. Their love affair was an example of devotion and support. John told everyone, each of us, I'm sure, that Deborah, the lovely Deborah, her first name is Lovely. The lovely Deborah was his strength, his steady hand, and his most important advisor and closest friend. And oh, how justifiably proud he was that she was continuing the legendary Dingell service in the Congress of the United States. I spent 2.5 hours with John that late afternoon. John, brought low by age and illness, was still the lion-hearted center of energy and outrage about the wrongs that he saw. His sense of humor, still intact, his concern for the House and for our country was as fervent as ever. We've talked for an hour about what was, what had been, and what should be. He had a deep concern for the future of our country, which he expressed in his last words for America. In it, he wrote this: "As I prepare to leave this all behind, I now leave you in control of the greatest nation of mankind, and pray God gives you the wisdom to understand the responsibility you hold in your hands." A little later, Sandy Levin joined John and me, as well as Debbie and John Orlando, one of his closest friends. Sandy and John reminisced about so many of the crusades pursued by the Dingell and Levin families and their allies. I was amazed at the sharpness of his memory. Sandy's brother, Senator Carl Levin, observed in 2005 that, and I quote, "The story of John Dingell is the story of the hopes and dreams of the American people of the last 50 years. And my church would say amen again. John Dingell indeed was a dreamer. And thankfully for us, he was also a doer. Before I left, I kissed him on the forehead and told him, "I love you, John." And I knew I spoke for all of his colleagues as well. He knew the end was nearing. I don't know that any of us knew it was 24 hours less. But even at the threshold of death, he was in command. He was concerned. He was ready for the next day, the next tweet, the next fight. As Debbie said, he was classic John Dingell. And that is how I will always remember him. Our dear and loyal friend, a great American, a great member of the House, and a very good and decent man. Godspeed, Big John.